The sky over the Yndonesic Bloc was the color of ash, a perpetual haze clinging to the broken remains of what had once been rich equatorial lands. Once, these islands and peninsulas had been known for their dense canopies, their abundant life, and their deep-rooted traditions. Now, centuries of chemical warfare, industrial toxins, and crude radiation had boiled away that abundance, leaving behind a scarred landscape of cracked earth, corroded scrap, and stagnant pools glistening with oily residue. There were still people here, ragged populations forced into feudal servitude by a despot who called himself Cardinal Tang, but the land no longer supported them kindly. They clung to life in decaying hive platforms and rickety strongholds that smelled of old metal and sour sweat. Atop a jagged ridge that overlooked a shattered coastline, the Emperor of Mankind observed this bleak panorama in silence. He stood tall and still, garbed in gilded armor that reflected no real sunlight, only the pallid glare filtering through the polluted clouds. Behind him stood a handful of Thunder Warriors, towering soldiers bred in secret labs. Their enormous frames and grim, battle-worn helmets projected raw power. None spoke. The tension in the air was thicker than the haze that drifted in irregular patterns across the ruined plains below. They had come to bring an end to the Yndonesic Bloc's cruelty. For too long, Cardinal Tang had presided over a regime of terror and forced ignorance. He had directed pogroms and mass sterilizations, shaped society as if it were clay, and crushed underfoot anyone who dared to speak of knowledge or reason. The Emperor intended to sweep away this brutal legacy, to unify this part of Terra under the banner of a rational new order. He had done so elsewhere on the planet, breaking the backs of tyrants and petty gods, forging unity from chaos. Down on the coast, the flicker of distant fires marked the locations of fortified strongpoints. The Emperor's scouts had returned bearing word of entrenched defenders, gene-crafted brutes, and forbidden weapons. The Bloc's forces were not technologically sophisticated, but they were cruel and desperate. They would fight ferociously, as cornered beasts do, for they knew no other way to survive. Stepping forward, the Emperor raised one hand, signaling his Thunder Warriors to advance through a half-collapsed causeway that led toward the outer defenses. The time had come to dismantle this relic of old night, one twisted fortress at a time. The Thunder Warriors descended first, moving in disciplined packs through corridors of twisted girders and collapsed overhangs. Their boots crunched through dust and broken glass, resonating like distant thunder beneath the old plating. Rusted pipelines wound overhead, dripping acidic runoff onto the battered arm plates of these engineered soldiers. They marched in silence, each step taking them closer to the Bloc's edge settlements, makeshift cities that had once been coastal hubs but now resembled industrial graveyards, rotting in slow stagnation. Between jagged outcroppings of steel, the Emperor could see the faint glow of cluster lamps and flickering torches. The Yndonesic Bloc's outposts were strung along these shores, a chain of fortified positions built to ward off any who dared intrude. He knew what they would find there. Half-starved militiamen bound by fear and indoctrination, armed with old projectile rifles and shock spears patched together from centuries-old designs. Behind them lurked more fearsome entities, Cardinal Tang's chosen, men and women enhanced by crude genetic tampering and ritual scarring. Their loyalty to Tang had been etched into nerve and bone. High overhead, clouds of metallic dust drifted, occasionally scattering the dim light in eerie patterns. Some of the Emperor's scouts pressed ahead, lean augmetic servitors scanning for hidden tripwires or traps. Every so often, the silence was broken by a sharp crack, a distant shot fired by a desperate sentry or a makeshift explosive triggered by a nervous defender. The Emperor knew the shock of his force's arrival would spread quickly among Tang's followers. Rumor and panic would run through the huddled masses like a fever, urging them to stand and fight, or to flee deeper into the city's dark heart. A sudden burst of gunfire lit the gloom. The Thunder Warriors took it in stride, shrugging off the rounds with armor designed to repel more formidable weapons. Their return fire was measured, not the wild storm of violence one might expect, but precise and deliberate. Within moments, the defenders' weapon pits fell silent. The Emperor continued his approach, his presence anchoring the morale of every soldier under his command. This was the pattern of unification. Layer by layer, the old cruelty would be stripped away until no idol of fear remained standing. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burning oil and charred metal. Tang's inner sanctum still lay ahead, deep within the old coastal platforms. The Emperor pressed on, intent on bringing reason's dawn to a land that had long forgotten the light. They moved deeper into the remnants of a once proud maritime civilization, each pace taking them from broken shorelines into the interior latticework of steel and concrete that had become the block's central fortress. Here, weathered platforms connected older structures to newer constructions, forming a vertical labyrinth of corridors and ramps. Much of this place had been rebuilt over centuries of hardship, never wholly stable. The Emperor's warriors advanced with care, mindful of supports that had corroded until they were brittle as old bone. The scent of decay deepened. Tang's subjects, forced into cramped living spaces and denied proper sanitation or respite, had long suffered here. Some fled at the mere sight of the Thunder Warriors, darting like pale ghosts between gaps in the metalwork. The Emperor's advance guard did not fire at these fleeing figures. They were not the enemy, merely victims caught in the crossfire of history. The Emperor offered no signal to halt them. He understood that, if given the chance, many would prefer to watch the old regime crumble from a safe distance. As the invaders pressed on, pockets of resistance emerged in shadowed alcoves. Ragged militias, emboldened by the panic gripping their masters, fired old slug throwers that sparked angrily against reinforced plating. The Thunder Warriors countered with disciplined volleys, shredding barricades of welded scrap and scattering their defenders. Occasionally, one of Tang's chosen charged into the fray. Tall, feral silhouettes with patchwork augmentation and crude subdermal plating. They rushed forward, brandishing cleavers of serrated metal, their eyes wide with chemically induced fury. Yet even these brutal constructs foundered against gene-forged muscle and imperial steel. They fell as quickly and silently as the rest, leaving only mangled corpses for the fungal blooms that thrived in damp corners. Deeper still, the Emperor spotted the faded iconography of the old faith Tang had imposed. Rusted effigies and crude glyphs had been bolted to support columns, depicting a twisted vision of purity and tradition. Tang's doctrine had vilified technology and learning, promising a return to a supposed golden past through suffering and sacrifice. But the Emperor knew that knowledge was key to humanity's survival. He would not let one more generation be shaped by these lies. Pressing onward, the clatter of battle drifted behind them. The heart of the block's tyranny lay ahead, and the Emperor intended to claim it before this polluted night gave way to any false dawn. Further in, the terrain became a nest of exposed conduits and precarious walkways. Some platforms were suspended by ancient chain assemblies, swaying gently in the poisoned air. The sound of boots on metal and the distant crack of gunfire wove together into a grim chorus. Each step brought the Emperor's forces closer to the core of Tang's dominion. The stench intensified, old chemical pools venting foul steam, half-submerged machinery grinding without purpose, and the lingering musk of too many humans crammed into too small a space. The Emperor moved at a measured pace, never hurried, yet never delayed without reason. Ahead, a flicker of shifting lights hinted at a more substantial defensive line. Thunder Warriors formed into staggered ranks, ready to absorb whatever fury these cultish overseers might unleash. Data scrolled through their visor feeds, scanning for power signatures or weapon arrays that might pose a threat beyond the crude small arms encountered so far. Deeper they pushed, encountering the stiffening resistance of Tang's inner guard. These were no ragged conscripts. Grim-faced enforcers wearing layered placard armor, hunched behind improvised bulwarks made from scavenged plating. They fired concentrated volleys, managing to force the Emperor's vanguard to slow, but nothing halted them. Under covering fire from their comrades, Thunder Warriors worked methodically, lobbing incendiary charges that burst into small suns of flame. The defenders screamed as old polymers and stored lubricants ignited, sending black smoke coiling upward. From behind the bulwarks, a voice wailed, words half lost in the clangor. Possibly some litany of Tang's faith, a recitation of lies that had kept these people chained. The Emperor advanced, listening without reaction, stepping over twisted girders and scorched bodies. He understood fear and desperation well enough. He knew these fanatics had been taught to expect a cleansing of all knowledge, a return to some imagined purity through violent denial. But there would be no comfort found in these doctrines tonight. The last defenders broke, fleeing down corridors that buckled beneath their frantic steps. Thunder Warriors followed, weapons ready, pushing ever closer to the block's nerve center. The Emperor surveyed the path ahead, assessing structural weaknesses, anticipating the final knot of resistance. Farther along, a cluster of old habitat modules had been refitted as shrines and guard posts. Within them, perhaps, Cardinal Tang's circle of advisors and closest followers would make their stand. The Emperor pressed on, intent on delivering a final demonstration of what unity truly meant. The inner sections of the fortress city revealed an intricate pattern of walkways and chambered halls, many sealed off with half-forgotten locking mechanisms. Layers of old insulation and gnarled wiring protruded from ragged breaches in the walls. It was clear that the Yndonesic Bloc's rulers had allowed their infrastructure to decay. Here, in the long halls where the Emperor's gene-forged soldiers advanced, the smell of stale air and corroded metals clung like a second skin. Shadows danced across walls, marred by heretical symbols, half-daubed in dried substances that might once have been pigments, or perhaps the blood of dissenters. On occasion, hunched figures darted past side passages, clutching tools or crude weapons. Some fired desperate shots at the intruders, only to be cut down before they could reload. Others simply ran, limbs awkwardly contorted, as if unsure whether to hide or surrender. The Emperor noted these details silently. He sensed the despair and confusion permeating this place. The fear was palpable, the Cardinals' unholy grip slipping as the truth of their vulnerability came crashing down. Every corridor wrested from the enemy offered new insight into what this regime valued: control built on ignorance and brutality. He would end that legacy here, and then move forward, always forward, toward the grand unity of Terra. Ahead, the Thunder Warriors halted at a reinforced portal, an ancient bulkhead studded with jury-rigged sensors and small, flickering devices. Its surface bore carved runes and twisted effigies that were meant to instill dread. One of the warriors stepped forward, servo-enhanced limbs flexing, and planted a breaching charge. A muffled detonation followed, sending flakes of old metal skittering down the corridor as the door buckled inward. Behind it lay an antechamber lit by smoky torches, their chemical flames casting sickly hues on rows of kneeling figures clad in patchwork armor. These were the priest warriors who served Cardinal Tang's theocratic rule, their faces marked by stylized burns and ritual scars. They bared their teeth in defiance, shrieking oaths to their captive god ideals. Some brandished shock lances that crackled with unstable energy. Others hefted makeshift flamers fueled by scavenged promethium. The Emperor's warriors spread out, leveling weapons with practiced calm. They prepared to show these zealots that no cry to false divinities would halt the march of humanity's true future. In the torchlit gloom, the priest warriors lunged forward, voices raised in frenzied defiance. Crude shock lances sparked against the Thunder Warriors' armor, while makeshift flamers wheezed flames across the chamber's tarnished walls. The Emperor's troops stood firm, answering the assault with disciplined volleys of fire. Each measured burst cut down attackers before they could close the distance. Within moments, the last zealot fell, the clash subsiding into the quiet hiss of cooling weaponry. When the echoes faded, the chamber held only twisted metal, spent shells, and the lingering smell of scorched steel. The Emperor stepped into the center, evaluating the scene with calm purpose. He gave no outward sign of triumph or regret. This was a necessary step toward the future bear he intended to shape. Thunder Warriors advanced past fallen adversaries without pause. They were instruments of unification, not cruelty, and their mission allowed no time for lingering sentiments. Beyond the antechamber, a corridor opened. Chains hung from overhead beams, and once functional data slates dangled in silent mockery of learning denied. Rust and corrosion dimmed any lingering glint of technology's past glory. The Emperor pressed onward, guided by reports indicating a final bulkhead ahead. Behind it lay a hardened position, fortified with salvaged weaponry. Servo turrets, reassembled from old components and thick plating placed at odd angles, would form the defenders' last line. This was the heart of Cardinal Tang's domain, the final refuge of those who still believed terror could prevail. Thunder Warriors positioned themselves with methodical precision, awaiting the Emperor's signal. The air seemed heavier here, as though the very structure resisted the idea of a world remade. Yet the Emperor had overcome more formidable obstacles elsewhere on Terra. With each conquest, he brought humanity closer to unity and reason. No barricade of scavenged steel or archaic dogma would halt that march. A subtle gesture from the Emperor set the squads moving. They advanced with unshakable resolve, their boots echoing along the corridor. Each step brought them nearer to the center of old lies and cruelty, where outdated beliefs would yield to a grand vision. The hour had come to peel back the last defenses and ensure that when the dawn of a better Terra arrived, the Yndonesic Bloc would stand as part of it, cleansed of the tyranny that had once defined it. They gathered at the final barrier, a broad bulkhead sealed with heavy clamps and studded with makeshift plating. Beyond it, muffled sounds hinted at hurried preparations, shuffling steps, the clank of repositioned weapons, and the tense whispers of those who knew their world was about to collapse. The Emperor stood at the center of his warriors, each of them poised and ready. An augmetic servitor scuttled forward, extended a cutting torch, and began slicing through the barrier's rusted seams. Molten flecks of metal dripped to the floor, and a ragged glow outlined the shape of the opening. When the slab finally gave way with a shrill groan, the Emperor's soldiers pressed inward, weapons raised and senses sharp. Inside, the defenders had mustered whatever strength remained. Servo turrets cobbled from old industrial arms whirred toward the intruders. Each turret belched streams of heavy rounds, the air filling with the tang of hot metal and sparks. Thunder Warriors responded in disciplined patterns, aiming precisely into the heart of each improvised gun nest. One after another, these last weapons fell silent, their makeshift mountings collapsing in showers of sparks. In the smoky haze, a ring of figures knelt around a raised platform. There, draped in soiled ceremonial robes, stood a handful of Tang's closest advisors, old men and women whose eyes darted with desperation. Their garments bore faded sigils of the old faith, marks of a twisted dogma that had long ago forsaken reason for cruelty. At their backs, an emaciated prisoner, perhaps a scholar or survivor of the old intelligentsia, trembled behind crude bars. The Emperor's gaze lingered on the prisoner for an instant before settling on the advisors. A voice quivered at the edge of the platform, pleading for mercy or perhaps trying to bargain. The Emperor offered no reply. He advanced, each step echoing in the silence that followed the last turret's demise. His Thunder Warriors flanked him, their presence making it clear that no amount of begging would restore this broken order. The advisors cowered, clutching worn talismans, their doctrines and lies stripped of meaning now that their enforcers lay vanquished. With calm deliberation, the Emperor approached, ready to unmake the final vestiges of Cardinal Tang's nightmare and open the path to a new chapter in these wounded lands. Under sputtering lamps, the Emperor's silent regard weighed heavily on those who had shaped the Yndonesic Bloc's horrors. These advisors, once proud architects of oppression, now trembled against corroded walls and broken machinery. Their robes, stained with the dust and grime of their collapsing order, bore symbols of faith turned to empty superstition. No one dared meet the Emperor's gaze. They tried to speak, quavering excuses, half-formed pleas, but the Emperor's warriors were unmoved. With a curt gesture, the Thunder Warriors advanced. Their approach was not gentle. They seized the advisors by shoulders and arms, pushing them down and binding their wrists with unyielding restraint. Protests choked into silence, words failing beneath the steady pressure of armor-clad hands. There would be no clemency for those who had twisted knowledge into chains. Nearby, an emaciated figure remained trapped behind jury-rigged bars. On the Emperor's command, a Thunder Warrior tore the makeshift cage open. The freed captive staggered free, trembling but alive. The Emperor did not pause for thanks. He needed no gratitude. He would restore order and reason without seeking praise. Let the rescued survivor bear witness to a future where truth, not terror, guided human destinies. One of the advisors, still half kneeling, raised trembling fingers as if to plead again, but a Thunder Warrior's stern presence ended any argument before it began. The Emperor did not linger to explain or lecture. He turned and strode deeper into the fortress, leaving these remnants of cruelty in his soldiers' firm custody. Their fate lay beyond old lies and old excuses. They would face justice under the rule of reason the Emperor would bring, not the twisted dogma of the past. As his footsteps echoed into the next corridor, the Emperor's thoughts settled on the final prize, Cardinal Tang himself. Tang, who had molded this place into a pit of fear and ignorance, would soon stand before the judgment of unity. Beyond these dim halls lay the last stronghold of a regime that had smothered hope beneath doctrine and blade. The Emperor would end it here and now, ensuring that from the ashes of tyranny, a new order would rise. Down a corridor of warped struts and half-sealed bulkheads, the Emperor advanced, Thunder Warriors at his side. The path bore signs of a hasty retreat, overturned crates, dropped tools, and hastily discarded symbols of Tang's faith. The air still carried the tang of old fumes, and every step stirred fine layers of dust that drifted in the ruddy half-light. Somewhere ahead, past the last line of improvised defenses, Cardinal Tang himself awaited. They came to a heavy door marked with twisted iconography, scratches and runes etched into the metal. Its surface bore the likeness of a chained world wreathed in flames. Perhaps it once meant something grand to Tang's followers. Now it was just another relic of fear. The Emperor signaled, and the door was forced open, hinges screeching in protest. Beyond it lay a wide chamber that had once been a command center. Banks of equipment, many gutted for parts or crudely reconfigured, lined the walls. Unsteady light flickered from ceiling lamps, illuminating a figure standing behind an angled console near the far end. Cardinal Tang was no imposing presence, but he held himself stiffly, draped in threadbare robes that hinted at former splendor. A strange device of twisted metal and old wiring hung around his neck like a relic. Tang's eyes flashed with a mixture of fury and terror. He spat words of condemnation into the stale air, invoking old rites and lost traditions. His voice, once a tool to command thousands, sounded thin and strained against the Emperor's silence. Where Tang had once relied on the lash and the brand, now he found himself face to face with a force that owed him nothing and offered no escape. Thunder Warriors fanned out, careful and steady, weapons raised but held in readiness. Tang's hand drifted to a switch on the console. Perhaps he meant to trigger a trap or release some final horror. The Emperor's gaze pinned him in place. Tang's grip faltered, knuckles whitening on the switch's handle. Sweat traced lines down his hollow cheeks. No words were needed to mark this moment. Tang understood that he had lost everything. The Emperor advanced, measured and calm, prepared to settle the account that had been centuries in the making. The fate of the Yndonesic Bloc's despot would be decided here, beneath dim lights and the silent witness of broken machines. Cardinal Tang stood cornered in a chamber stripped of its old power. His robes, once symbols of authority, now seemed threadbare and irrelevant. The Emperor faced him without anger, without mercy, only with the steady focus of one who had a purpose larger than any single life. Tang's threats and pleas, if he even dared utter them, hung uselessly in the stale air. The Emperor's Thunder Warriors encircled the disgraced leader. Under any other tyrant's rule, Tang might have found some leverage or space to maneuver. Not here. He had built his strength on fear and the denial of knowledge, crushing insight beneath superstition. Now the instrument of unity had arrived, and it would not be denied. There was no drawn-out debate, no bargaining. The Emperor had come too far and seen too many horrors to waste words on a cornered despot. Tang's brief defiance ended as abruptly as it had begun. Subdued and taken into custody, he posed no further threat. His fate, no longer his own, would be shaped by the new order the Emperor forged. The Yndonesic Bloc would be remade, its factories retooled, its people freed to learn, to question, and to hope again. Though they might not grasp the change immediately, they would one day understand that the price paid here was the cost of a future built on reason rather than terror. In the end, Cardinal Tang was not struck down by the Emperor's hand. Instead, he was sent away, lost into the deeper machinery of imperial justice and the reshaping of Terra. It is unknown in the annals of Warhammer history why the Emperor let Tang live when he brought swifter ends to so many other tyrants. Perhaps one day, we will be granted a book that sheds light on these subtle decisions that shaped humanity's future. Outside the chamber where Tang had been taken into custody, the Emperor observed the work of consolidation with impassive calm. His Thunder Warriors spread through the corridors and platforms, rooting out lingering pockets of defiance with precise, unforgiving strikes. Sparks flew as old weapon caches were forced open, their contraptions disassembled without fanfare. Amidst the gloom of failing lamps and corroded metal, the stench of spent munitions and charred composites lingered. Nothing about this place suggested peace or comfort, only the tense stillness that followed a hard-won conquest. Beneath twisted beams, clusters of frightened survivors looked on, uncertain of their fate. Many had given service to Tang's regime, willingly or otherwise. Now they confronted the silent authority of a power that demanded obedience yet promised no divine vision. The Emperor did not stoop to reassure them. He had torn down their old order, shattered their idols, and exposed the emptiness of their faith. Now they would learn the harsh truth. There were no gods to save them, no mystic prophecies to shield their ignorance. Terra belonged to humanity alone, and humanity would pay whatever price was necessary to endure. A group of proto-iterators, summoned earlier, ventured into these grim halls at the Emperor's silent behest. They bore no weapons, but their purpose was as unyielding as any blade. They would begin the task of teaching a doctrine of disbelief, dissolving the layers of fear and superstition that had fortified Tang's tyranny. It was a delicate work, yet one that would be carried out without sentimentality. The Emperor had no patience for coddling minds steeped in illusion. The iterators' words would cut deep, their logic as relentless as a gene-forged warrior's assault. Now the Emperor turned his gaze upon the sprawling expanse of ruined infrastructure. Corroded platforms, failing energy conduits, and unreliable purification systems would all need to be reclaimed and directed toward a future guided by reason. The methods would be stern, the results born of blood and iron. There would be no paradise here, only the relentless drive toward a unified Terra where no false creed could take root. In this grim aftermath, the Emperor stood at the apex of order imposed by force. Atheist and unwavering, he would shape the Yndonesic Bloc's destiny through the blunt instrument of truth, ensuring that fear would never again be sanctified behind closed doors or corrupted shrines. Deep within the Bloc's tangled core, the iterators began their grim task. They stepped onto collapsed platforms. Twisted girders and broken pipes cast jagged shadows. Thunder warriors stood guard at choke points. Their silent vigilance a reminder that enlightenment, as defined by the Emperor, would not come through gentle persuasion alone. Here, the Emperor's word reigned absolute. Reason without mercy, knowledge without comfort. The iterators approached small knots of survivors huddled beneath scorched walkways. These people, unarmed and hollow-eyed, had no illusions left. Their old rights had offered them nothing when real power came crushing down. Now, faced with these envoys of the new order, they listened with dread and confusion. The iterators spoke of a universe where gods did not stir behind the veil, where only humanity's wits and will mattered. They spoke without kind smiles, without warm reassurances. Their tone held the weight of a harsh truth meant to shatter old lies. Some survivors flinched at these words. A few muttered half-forgotten prayers, others shrank back, uncertain. The iterators did not beg them to understand. They demanded it. Clear away the ghosts in your mind, they insisted. Recognize that Terra's enemies could not be banished by devotion or blood rites. The Emperor's armies would stand guard, but the people themselves had to abandon comforting myths. Elsewhere, small pockets of Tang's most fervent supporters still clung to their idols. They whispered secret litanies to one another, hoping their old gods would return, or that Tang's unseen allies would rise. When the Thunder Warriors found such gatherings, they ended them swiftly. A few shouted curses, others pleaded for mercy, but all such entreaties fell into the void of the Emperor's design. Ignorance would not be indulged. Lingering traces of the old faith would be ground out like sparks under an iron boot. In the background, the Emperor moved through a half-collapsed corridor, his heavy steps echoing like distant thunder. He did not need to see every exchange. He trusted his chosen agents to carry out his will. He had decreed that a new understanding would take root here. Even if it was forced down people's throats, even if the truth tasted bitter to them, it would be swallowed. The age of false idols was over, and in the emptiness they left behind, the Emperor's rational creed would bloom, hard, necessary, and utterly unforgiving. As the Emperor's forces swept through the Yndonesic Bloc, their consolidation of power revealed deeper layers of Tang's influence. Beneath the crumbling infrastructure, caches of forbidden technology and encrypted data slates lay hidden in vaults and forgotten chambers. Among these discoveries were schematics for automated defense drones and experimental gene troop enhancements, remnants of Tang's contingency plans to resist the inevitable. In the shadowed corridors beneath a ruined stronghold, a squad of Thunder Warriors encountered the first sign of these hidden defenses. Drones, ancient constructs patched together with crude ingenuity, patrolled the darkness. Their limbs moved in stiff mechanical patterns, scanning for any sign of intrusion. When the Thunder Warriors advanced, the drones responded with lethal bursts of energy fire. Even these gene-forged soldiers found their heavy plating tested by the drones' focused assaults. Reports of similar encounters began to surface across the block. Voxlinks crackled with warnings of ambushes in half-flooded tunnels and trapped passageways rigged to collapse. Though Cardinal Tang himself was gone, his loyalists had prepared meticulously for this moment. They knew the block's labyrinthine depths intimately and used that knowledge to strike from the shadows, targeting supply lines, attacking isolated squads, and sabotaging equipment stockpiles. The Emperor stood at a makeshift command post in a captured citadel, observing holo displays that outlined newly discovered threats. He assessed the patterns with calm detachment. These disruptions would not deter him. He directed his forces methodically, sending them into the block's underbelly to hunt down every last cell of resistance. The Thunder Warriors moved with grim resolve, while proto-iterators scoured the recovered data slates to predict where the next assault might erupt. For every drone dismantled, every ambush countered, the Emperor's hold on the region tightened. Yet, the more his warriors pressed into the heart of these old strongholds, the clearer it became that Tang's loyalists would not yield easily. They had nothing to lose and no future but defiance. As the clashes intensified in silent corridors and dimly lit vaults, a single truth loomed larger than before. The Yndonesic Bloc's final submission would not come swiftly. Deep in its hidden places, the embers of Tang's legacy still burned, and the Emperor would need to crush them entirely before true unity could be assured. As squads of Thunder Warriors advanced deeper into the block's ruin-choked corridors, the nature of the conflict shifted. It was no longer a straightforward engagement of armies in open battle. Instead, it became a campaign of close-quarter ambushes and sudden strikes in cramped passages and half-collapsed domes. Every step forward brought the Emperor's soldiers into contact with Tang's last, desperate retainers, those who clung to old loyalties like barnacles to a sinking hull. In one such passage, a unit of gene-forged warriors advanced under flickering emergency lights. They moved in formation, bolters readied, scanning every shadowed alcove. A hush settled over them like a heavy shroud. When the attack came, it was swift and silent. A drone darted from behind a broken ventilation shaft, plasma discharge sizzling against ceramite plating. The Thunder Warriors answered in kind, muzzle flashes strobing as they cut the machine apart. Scattered sparks and shards of metal clattered to the floor, and once again the corridor fell still. Yet it was never still for long. Loyalist fighters darted through maintenance ducts and old service tunnels, hurling incendiaries or loosing crude but deadly energy bolts. These were no mere civilians. Many bore implant scars or salvaged augmetics, crude reflections of the Emperor's gene work. They had been shaped by Tang's regime to be dangerous in precisely this environment. In response, the Emperor's command teams adapted. Scout servitors were deployed in advance of the Thunder Warriors, their lenses sweeping for power signatures and subtle heat trails. Flame units moved in pairs, prepared to flush out hidden snipers from recessed niches. The fighting took on a grim rhythm. Push forward, absorb a volley of fire, retaliate with overwhelming force, move on. Each increment of progress was bought with sweat, sparks, and the acrid smell of burning insulation. While these brutal exchanges continued, proto-iterators remained outside the hot zones, busy deciphering captured data. Their work might offer a clue, some pattern in the sabotage, some hidden nexus where all these insurgent groups converged. If they could pinpoint the heart of this insurrection, the Emperor's forces could cut it out in one decisive strike. For now, though, the Thunder Warriors pressed on. There was no room for mercy, no time for negotiation. The block's depths had become a crucible in which the Emperor's iron-willed vision would be tested. Here, reason was hammered out in the relentless forge of conflict, and nothing would stand in the way of unity. Not lost ideals, not hidden drones, and certainly not the ghosts of Tang's legacy. As the Thunder Warriors pressed deeper, their pursuit began to unveil clues to the insurgents' nature. Scattered data slates recovered from shattered drone control stations contained half-corrupted directives. Each one bore a fragment of a greater plan. Instructions to sabotage power relays, to target specific corridors critical for supply movement, and to lure Imperial squads into carefully prepared kill zones. In an improvised command hub set up near an intersection of three major tunnels, a proto-iterator named Orlov bent over a flickering holodisplay. He muttered to himself, cross-referencing notes and running comparison scripts. Nearby, a Thunder Warrior commander, helmet crested with a jagged plume of iron feathers, stood guard. The warrior's presence was a reminder that time was short and patience was limited. The Emperor's tolerance for extended skirmishes ran thin, especially now that the main bulk of Tang's threat should have been crushed. After long moments, Orlov's eyes widened. "I have something," he said, voice scratchy through his rebreather mask. He tapped a sequence on the holo controls, projecting a schematic of the subterranean complex. It highlighted a maze of bypass corridors and sealed vaults deep below the block's most ancient foundation levels. "They're channeling their efforts here," Orlov continued. "An old nexus of power distribution and data archives. If we strike there, we might sever their coordination at the source." The Thunder Warrior commander nodded, sending a brief vox burst up the chain of command. The Emperor's orders came swiftly in return. Redeploy squads and servitors toward this nexus. No holding back. The corridors would be cleared, the vaults forced open, and whatever machinery or lieutenants of Tang's legacy lurked there would be destroyed without hesitation. As orders spread through the ranks, the fighting intensified. The Loyalists seemed to sense that their sanctuary had been discovered, launching furious ambushes to slow the Imperial advance. Grenades clanged against bulkheads, spitting shards of metal and ceramic. Drones lunged in packs, forcing the Thunder Warriors to expend precious ammunition. Still, the Emperor's soldiers pressed on, their resolve unshaken. With every meter gained, the shape of the final conflict became clearer. Deep below these broken halls, in a place never intended for sunlight or human comfort, the Emperor would confront the last embers of Tang's resistance. There, amid tangled wiring and dormant constructs, the truth of their plan would be revealed and extinguished. The descent into the lower vaults was a grueling ordeal, even for the Thunder Warriors. These were no simple maintenance corridors, but a labyrinth of collapsed passageways, blind corners, and treacherous footing. Every advance was contested. The Loyalist desperation was palpable, their traps ingenious and brutal. Explosive charges, concealed under fallen debris, collapsed entire sections of the tunnels, and automated turrets, ancient and half-malfunctioning, spewed streams of bullets at any movement. But the Thunder Warriors were relentless. Where traps claimed their brothers, they forged on, their wrath a terrible thing to behold. A warrior named Darok, his armor scored with the marks of countless skirmishes, took point in one of the spearheading teams. His heavy shield deflected torrents of fire, while his power mace reduced barricades to smoldering fragments. Behind him, servitors laden with breaching equipment and munitions followed, their monotone chants of devotion to the Emperor blending eerily with the sounds of battle. As they neared the Nexus, the resistance grew frenzied. Loyalists who had once fought with measured discipline now charged in wild, suicidal waves. They hurled themselves against the Thunder Warriors, detonating crude explosives strapped to their bodies. The Warriors' contempt for such tactics was evident in their brutal efficiency, every swing of their weapons turning these human bombs into little more than charred smears on the walls. Finally, Darok's squad reached the reinforced blast doors, marking the entrance to the Nexus. The thick plasteel slabs were marred by decades of corrosion, but still stood firm. Behind them, a cacophony of machinery and human voices echoed faintly, a hive of activity preparing for what seemed to be their final stand. Orlov, who had been brought forward despite the risks, examined the doors. "These were not meant to be opened again," he muttered, tracing his gloved fingers over faded inscriptions and arcane sigils etched into the metal. "This predates even the Bloc's rise. Whatever is behind here might not be of their making." Darok glanced back at his squad. "What do you need?" Orlov hesitated, but only for a moment. "Time, and for you to hold whatever comes at us from behind." Darok grinned, the expression a savage promise. "You'll have both." As the breaching charges were carefully affixed, the tension in the air thickened. Every soldier could feel it. that primal sense of crossing a threshold where nothing would be the same again. The blast ripped through the doors with a deafening roar, sending shockwaves through the narrow corridors. Fragments of ancient plasteel rained down, and for a moment, the world was nothing but fire and sound. When the smoke cleared, the Thunder Warriors surged forward, their hulking forms silhouetted against the glowing embers of the shattered gateway. What lay beyond was a scene out of myth. The Nexus was a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with conduits and machinery that hummed with unsettling life. A central dais dominated the space, atop which stood an array of mechanisms that defied understanding. Rotating rings of polished black metal hovered in perfect synchronicity, encasing what seemed to be a pulsing sphere of light, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. Around the device, a cadre of engineers and priests frantically worked, their robes drenched with sweat, their voices raised in prayers and shouted commands. The Loyalist defenders here were not the ragged remnants encountered in the tunnels. These were their elite, armored warriors equipped with energy weapons and advanced combat gear that matched the Thunder Warriors in technological sophistication, if not in brute strength. They moved with precision, forming overlapping fields of fire that forced Darok's squad into cover. "Suppressive fire!" Darok bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. His warriors responded instantly, laying down a withering hail of bullets and plasma that forced the defenders to retreat into defensive positions. Orlov, shielding his eyes from the radiant device on the dais, approached cautiously. "That's no simple weapon. It's temporal." His voice was almost reverent, tinged with fear. "A time severance engine, capable of unraveling time itself. If they activate it, Terra's history could..." "They won't," Darok growled, his tone final. "Not while we breathe." But the Loyalists had no intention of giving them a choice. From hidden alcoves, servitors armed with volatile explosives shambled forward, their jerky movements betraying their single purpose. Behind them, the engineers chanted louder, their voices blending with the escalating hum of the device. "Orlov, shut it down!" Darok shouted, stepping into the open to intercept the servitors. His power mace came down in devastating arcs, reducing the first two to sparking heaps. "Warriors, hold the line." The chamber devolved into a maelstrom of violence, the stakes made clear by the unnatural pulsations emanating from the time severance engine. The air itself seemed to warp and shimmer, as if the device was already beginning to unravel reality. The chamber erupted into chaos, the din of battle overwhelming as the Thunder Warriors clashed with the Loyalist elite. Darok, his armor battered but unyielding, pressed forward through the barrage, his power mace a blur of destructive arcs. Behind him, Orlov sprinted to the device's interface, his servitors forming a protective perimeter around the delicate machinery. The time severance engine pulsed, its hum deafening, and the air shimmered with a strange distortion. Yet as Orlov reached the console, he found no resistance, no rejection from the ancient systems. Instead, the interface flickered to life, symbols and commands cascading across its surface. "Unbelievable," Orlov muttered, his fingers flying across the glowing keys. "The system, it recognizes me. It must be calibrated for human input, not their crude imitations." Less wonder, more action. Darok roared, cleaving through a Loyalist who had dared to approach Orlov. The enemy commanders shouted desperate orders, but their defense was faltering. Each strike from the Thunder Warriors broke another layer of their resolve. Orlov worked furiously, the symbols responding to his commands with an almost eager efficiency. "I'm overriding the activation protocols. Shutting it down now," he called, his voice steady despite the pandemonium around him. A sudden pulse of energy surged from the machine, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stutter. The Thunder Warriors froze mid-motion, their forms caught in a flickering tableau. Then, just as suddenly, the distortion faded, the engine's hum dwindling to silence. "It's done," Orlov declared, stepping back as the device powered down. The pulsating sphere of light at its core dissolved into nothingness, and the strange symbols on the console faded into darkness. The remaining Loyalists, seeing their ultimate weapon rendered inert, fell into disarray. Without their unholy relic, their zeal faltered, and the Thunder Warriors pressed the advantage. The chamber became a slaughterhouse, the last vestiges of resistance swept away with ruthless efficiency. When the final echoes of battle faded, Darok stood over the shattered remains of the enemy. His breathing was heavy, but his resolve unshaken. He turned to Orlov, who was examining the dormant machine with a mix of awe and caution. "Contact Malkador," Darok ordered, his voice resonating with authority. "He'll want to see this for himself." The Thunder Warriors began securing the chamber, their grim work accompanied by the distant rumble of collapsing tunnels as the last Loyalist traps detonated in vain. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of grim finality. The shattered remnants of the Loyalist defenders were strewn across the chamber, their desperation extinguished. Thunder Warriors moved through the wreckage with practiced precision, securing the Nexus and ensuring no traps or hidden threats remained. Darok stood before the dormant time severance engine, its once menacing hum now silenced. Orlov hovered near the console, his fingers tracing the lifeless interface. He murmured to himself, half in wonder, half in dread. This device, it was never meant to be wielded by mortals. What power did they think they could command here? Darok's gaze remained fixed on the machine, his thoughts difficult to read. "That's a question for Malkador," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He'll want to see this himself." The squad began their ascent from the lower vaults, the Thunder Warriors forming an unyielding guard around the device. Though its mechanisms were inert, its presence carried an oppressive weight, as if the very air around it remembered the potential it once held. When they emerged into the pale light of dawn, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and ash. Smoke rose from the battlefield above, where other Thunder Warrior detachments had crushed the remaining Loyalist forces. The once formidable fortifications of the Yndonesic Bloc's nexus were reduced to smoldering ruins, their banners trampled underfoot. At the forward command post, a sleek atmospheric transport had just arrived, its golden trim marking it as no ordinary vehicle. Malkador himself stepped out, flanked by two custodians. The Sigillite's presence was commanding, his robes untouched by the surrounding devastation. He moved with quiet purpose, his piercing gaze scanning the battlefield before settling on the Thunder Warriors and the device they had retrieved. Darok saluted, his massive frame bowing slightly. "The Nexus is secure, Lord Sigillite. The device lies dormant as we found it. It is beyond us." Malkador approached the time severance engine, his expression inscrutable. He placed a hand on its surface, his fingers brushing the faint runes etched into the polished black metal. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps even fear, crossed his face before his features hardened. "You've done well, Darok," Malkador said, his voice even. "This device is indeed beyond your understanding, and perhaps even mine, but it is now in our hands, where it cannot be misused." He turned to the custodians. "Prepare it for immediate transport to the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace. It will be sealed alongside the most dangerous relics of humanity's past." As the custodians began their work, Malkador turned back to Darok and the warriors. "You've silenced a threat that could have undone everything we've fought for. Remember this day, not for the device you've secured, but for the loyalty you've shown to the Emperor's vision." Darok nodded, his expression stoic, though pride gleamed in his eyes. The Thunder Warriors regrouped, their tasks completed, but their purpose undiminished. As Malkador prepared to leave, he paused, speaking to no one in particular. "There will be more like this. Ancient powers, dangerous remnants of our fractured past. It will take more than strength to secure Terra's future. It will take vigilance." With that, he boarded his transport, the device secured, and the Thunder Warriors watched as the craft disappeared into the smoke-filled skies, carrying with it a relic of unspeakable power and the promise of battles yet to come.